I'm starting the backup stream kind of late. Since I didn't ask Brian for help setting up the main stream this morning, there's a good chance parts of it or all of it won't work. so I'm doing a backup that I forgot to start. But with that, yes. And so in isolation, it's easier for me to make decisions. But when we add the pressure of life, doctrine becomes tougher to live than it is to think out when I'm planning sermons here, right? In the building or wherever an idea hits me. But when life stress comes, that's when it's different. So with that, what we really talked about on Wednesday started with kind of a simple illustration. And so I don't have to ask the question all over again. We talked about, okay, say you have just gotten a mortgage on a new place. Maybe you can take yourself back to that time in life when you had your first place. And
we just paid ours off.
Did you? There you go. Look,
38 years.
What kind of relief was that?
Oh, man.
Right?
Wonderful.
Yeah?
Some of our payments really were very low.
Yeah, we're
And
good.
it was like just.
That's all right. That's all right.
get
That's
out
all
of the
right.
way.
It's a relief either way. And we talked about, if you think back to when you first got your house, people were offering you the congratulations and all of the things that went along with it. If you were just sitting at dinner with friends, mulling over that time in your life, all the different things you would think about. We just brainstormed on Wednesday. People talked about things that were on the upside. Of course, having the joy of new home ownership. On the downside, all the things you would have to worry about in terms of repairs, because sometimes a new place doesn't come perfect, even when it's brand new. Being happy if you don't have roof issues. All the repairs you have to make, making you happy for all the ones you don't. And then after we got through with all that, we were like, wait a minute, there's one question nobody asked or no correction that anyone made. And what was that correction that no one made when we brainstormed all the highs and lows of new home ownership? That's right. So on day one, you didn't really own it, but did you correct your friend? Why didn't we think to correct our friends about whether we own the house?
Yeah.
Thank you. It was credited to us that we owned it. And so there are certain times when not correcting a factual error is actually misleading, but we said we have a cultural standard that says we credit home ownership at the time you make that deal and commit to making those payments. So it's not misleading, it's just our cultural assumption, right? And so when we're talking about the letter to the Galatians, we said that term credited comes up where? It's a place John has already mentioned. The Bible is awesome as an answer in most circumstances. It is not the unique answer that we need in this one, though. But yes, if I would go ahead and start, it is in the Bible, in the book of Galatians. It starts off by saying that, and I'm getting in the way, y'all, so I apologize. God promised Abraham. Abraham's response was that he believed. I before E except after C? There we go. He believed God. And as a result of believing God, he was
Righteous.
But what was the word that they used for how he was considered righteous? And this is
Faith.
it literally says he was blanked as righteous. You already know. Imputed, some translations say, and this is one where varying translations will help us out. Well, credited, exactly. Credited is the word that I think is closest to the meaning. And what does credited mean? Like, I know it sounds simple, but it's an important distinction to make. Why didn't it just say he was given? Is there a distinction in our culture between credited and given? So when you go back to the house illustration, when you go and sign that agreement for the house, with only, say, 10% equity, 20% equity, 30% equity in the house, why would the bank not write in your loan agreement or in your purchase agreement that you've been given the house? And so what is the difference between the word credited and given? And why didn't Paul necessarily use Abraham was gifted or granted righteousness? Is there a distinction between the word granted righteousness and credited righteousness?
I feel like credited has there's good faith effort. Like you've proven a little bit,
Yeah.
so you're probably gonna do what's right. Versus given's I don't know, I'm just gonna do this. I don't know what you're gonna do.
There you go. And so what happens if, say, on this house you have a mortgage, and as Ms. Laura has already mentioned, the mortgage is their guarantee, no matter what the language in the agreement is, that you will fully pay them for what they are giving you possession of. What happens if you default on your mortgage? You still get to keep the house? No, right? And so that is one of the reasons why it's so important to understand Paul's use of the term credited. Because Abraham, he says literally, Abraham walked in the footsteps of faith. What if Abraham, having been credited with righteousness, went and decided, you know what? Promised land sounds good, but I like Egypt. Egypt is just it's just better this time of year, right? What do you think happens if Abraham decides to walk a different way, even though he's been credited with righteousness? Do we have an illustration of that? What do you think happens? Do we even need to guess? Why? Because later on, John's already mentioned, he had been given the promise not only a land, but of a people and a son, right? And who was that son to come through? Sarah. But who did he try to help God out and bring it by? Hagar. And that worked out just perfectly, right? No. So we have an example of Abraham having been credited with righteousness, going a different way, and everything it went wrong. And we talked about it on Wednesday. It is now the longest running domestic dispute in world history. Because from that point on, we have the seeds of, sometimes people are like, well, how can you know the Bible is true? All you got to do is turn on the news and see what's going on and literally going on in Israel right now in the conflict of the Middle East. Trace back the lineages of those people to their biblical origins. This fight has been going on for thousands of years now, right? And it all goes back to that point in which Abraham took God's promise. Even though he was credited with righteousness, he went a different direction, and he found out that outside of actually walking in the footsteps of faith, there is misery. And if you walk outside of the footsteps of faith long enough, there's ultimately destruction that God promises outside of following through with the things that are within. What he's ultimately going to say at the end of Galatians, we said there's some verses. So it's easy to get Paul's words about law in Galatians and Romans confused with his opposition to all law. But we said that can't possibly be it. Why? Because God is coming back to punish the works of, literally in 2 Thessalonians, he's coming back to punish the works of, and the man of. Faith? No, not faith. Oh, sin. Yeah, but what's another word for the man of sin?
Satan.
He has an agent. What's another name of the agent that's called the man of sin? Antichrist. That's another one that fits in more literally with this. I know I'm asking too much. Thank you. You already knew. We talked about it on Wednesday. The man of lawlessness. So if he's coming back to punish lawlessness, how is he getting rid of all law? He's not. What he's doing is, if you look at the terms that he uses, and after we, hopefully chart it up, we'll look. He's literally talking about the works of the law, as opposed to all law. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And before the Christ, there was no answer to the law.
Yep.
But now there is. And Jesus is the answer to the law now.
And that's part of what he's going to go into. I don't want to trying to write it in sequence, but that's going to go right here. And that's going to be the contrast that he sets up in roughly his third example, right? Because what he's going to say is the law in his second example, so the first thing is he says, I'm trying to use colors to sort it out here, is Abraham was credited with righteousness, right? So if you understand credit, that's the first thing to understand about what was actually going on with Abraham. Second thing you need to understand about what was going on with Abraham is that the law came how many years after the promise? Roughly 450 years. So he's saying just in terms of sequence, the relationship or the covenant between God and Abraham or God and man through Abraham couldn't have been based on the law because the relationship started 450 years before the law came. And so then he's going to ask the question, okay, well, so why then the law? Why is the law important in the at all if it is not the basis of the covenant? Well, ultimately he's going to say, if I can get my color he's going to say it was, and we talked about this on Wednesday, and if we've been in churches very long, you've heard it before. What are some of the terms for what he describes as the purpose of the law? What role did it fulfill? Schoolmaster, and I'm going to use the word guardian here. And the thing that he says about a guardian is something that is, by illustration, set up over someone who he's going to literally call a child, right? And he says, as long as the child is under guardianship, he's really no better than what? Yeah, he's no better than a slave. So he's enslaved, right? But this is where what Brother Don talked about came in. In the contrast, we get to start seeing the contrast. But when Christ came in, I'm sorry. He uses a different term of the relationship that is formed between God and man under the new covenant, and he stops calling them children and he starts calling them sons. What's the difference, potentially, between a child and a son? Go ahead.
Maturity.
Thank you. And that's literally what he's talking about. He's literally drawing out a distinction in, I need to erase that because I wrote it in the wrong spot. He's really literally drawing a distinction in maturity.
And the son
Go ahead.
is still an heir.
Son's-
Even if he's he's not a slave. He's still the heir.
But
someday
functionally,
But
functionally,
he
he
is,
doesn't have this son freedom,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And we talked about before in the illustration of like the keys of the car. You're not giving your, right?
Not giving Keith.
Titus is a great driver now as your son. Did you make it home, Titus? You don't do that anymore, right? Right? However, he wouldn't have the keys at 2, right? And so that's the distinction we're drawing here. There is maturity that has set in under Christ and the law of Christ. Go ahead.
See, that's now flipped, though.
How so? Oh, no, he's saying.
They do call and ask if I got
Did
home.
you make it
If I
home?
got home.
Right? Fair
Reason
enough.
for that.
Right? My mom used to say, because my mom wants to take care of my grandma now, and they say, twice a child, once an adult, right? Because after a while it flips and we start
Sure
trying to start looking after, right? So yes, that's huge. All right, so I messed up here, but yes, there's that freedom that comes with trust and maturity, and that's what Paul is talking about in a lot of ways. And so he takes this son metaphor, and the reason why it's difficult to see in the text is because he starts to talk personally to the Galatians after he describes this son thing. He's like, okay, wait a minute. You understood this or you ran well. What's going on? Why would you go back to this? And so after he goes through that personal appeal of why would you go back to being enslaved and treated as children, then he starts to go into that whole issue of, next, we got blue, we got brown, we got orange, purple, sorry. Then he's going to get into the whole issue of, well, since we're talking about sons, there were 2 sons, as we've already mentioned. One was born under Hagar, right?
Yeah.
I messed it up. That's right. And one was under Sarah. And the one born under Sarah was in bondage, right?
No.
No, the one born under Sarah was free. And ultimately, the reason, I can't say the reason, but for years, the metaphor never really seemed to click with me until I started thinking about it. And can y'all see it kind of enough? Okay. Until I started thinking about the way in which this Ishmael came about. The way in which Ishmael came about had everything to do with, like he says, the flesh versus the promise. But that never really sunk in until I thought about it like this. The law that Paul is setting up a contrast to isn't all law. But what are some of the, I don't even want to ask it as a question, but I will. What are some of the characteristics of law? If you just have a biblical idea of examples you've seen of people misusing the law biblically, what are some examples that you've seen? And maybe we can work into how this finally started to make sense to me.
There's no gray area.
Go ahead,
You
yeah.
either follow the law
Yeah,
or you don't follow the law.
yeah, go ahead.
There's no, oh, well, but what about this? You know,
Right.
The law is specific on what you do and don't do.
Right, and so one of the things that we'll try, that sometimes we'll try to do in an effort to forgive is we get it out of order. We start forgiving before we have determined whether or not a violation has occurred, because we get nervous because the condemnation comes if I admit that I've done something wrong, right? And one of the great things about when we're going through that whole issue of how love covers a multitude of sins, or 1 Corinthians, Miss Laura talked about it's easier if I understand from the perspective of one of my children who I love to be able to do those things that talk about making peace. Love wants to do no harm, right? Those kinds of things. And I'm butchering them now because, yeah, that's what I do. So, but if you go back to the love passage, it's easier to apply those things that are very difficult. Trusting all things, believing all things, really, if you love the person that you are trying to forgive or build a relationship with. Much more difficult if not. And so sometimes when we are trying to build a relationship, we get the cart before the horse. And we're so eager to forgive that we don't do exactly what you said. There is a violation, but the more we begin to understand how much God loves us, the more we can feel at peace with that whole issue of, yes, I am guilty under the law. And I don't have to feel like I have to start making the justification. Oh, wait, that's another word that Paul uses, before I've actually made the confession, because those are two important stages of healing in God's prescription, right? And so one of the reasons why that's so important is when we talked about it before, when Moses was feeling that deep despair, he's like, look, I didn't make these people. I didn't want to leave the wilderness. After I failed, I was cool with shepherding, right? And so now, look, one of those moments, just kill me moments, right? If it's going to go on like that, just, yeah. But he's like, calm down, Moses. I'm going to hide you in the cleft of the rock. And you can't see me, but as I pass by, or as he passes by, right? Then it allows Moses to see enough of him to keep him encouraged. And as he passes by, he describes himself as a God who is full of mercy, but by no means acquitting the guilty. So how does that fit? How does that fit? Well, you have to always, that's why it says, set your mind on things above. If you can set your mind on his forgiveness, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to confess your faults. And so that helps God, because everything has to be based on truth. Well, how good is love that's not based on truth? What's that? It's nice. You say it's nothing, right? It's fun. Like, I heard this thing. I don't know if it was a movie, Love and Other Drugs. Oh, it feels awesome for a while, right? Oh my goodness, the euphoria, the dreaminess, right? But if it's not based on truth, what happens?
You come down.
And it can be the higher the artificial high, the worse the crash, right? Hey. And so that is one of the reasons why truth isn't simply, it's not harsh, the confession, or it's just understanding that it's so much easier to deal with the disappointment if they're not based on false expectations. And why is that so important in Galatians? Because the discussion I had with this brother this weekend, I've had with another preacher probably before I left for vacation, was so many times when I hear people talk about salvation by faith only, it's in response to the anxieties of the people in the congregation who have much stress about being saved but struggling, being saved even though they're struggling. And that's a legitimate concern, because if we're the least bit introspective and honest, we all have that struggle. But the reason why faith is so important is not because salvation is by faith alone, because that's not what the word says at all, right? As a matter of fact, it says it's literally the opposite in James. The way that we stop having to dismiss what James literally says about the relationship between faith and works is if we trust that God wants to forgive us so much that we can simply follow the process. We don't have to play around with the law, whether or not I've sinned. And we don't have to play around with the way that God has literally said it works through his apostles and prophets and other writers of the New Testament and the prophecies they fulfill from the Old. We can simply trust that it works as he said it did. And so what happens is, with this whole issue of flesh, what I began to realize, in part from what you were talking about, was in a lot of ways, Abraham was working out his own salvation through Hagar, or the fulfillment of his own promise through Hagar. And so that is typically in Scripture, those are the kinds of works, for lack of a better term, that are prohibited. But how do we reconcile that with the fact that the same Paul, who in Romans and Galatians talks about how your works can't save you, literally tells you in the letter to the Philippians to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, right? And so sometimes that debate between those who do not believe that salvation is by faith alone and those who do is that, well, who do you believe, Paul or James? As if Paul and James were in this debate. We would be in that debate if you didn't have Galatians. Let me first turn to Galatians, I think it's 5. We did kind of a word search. We had a word search kind of assignment on Wednesday for the folks who were here to actually look up faith alone or faith only and see where it comes up in the Bible. And I made a mistake because I'd forgotten the most obvious instance. But we're one of the only 2 instances, and only 2 that I know about, where faith only or faith alone literally comes up in the Bible, at least in the ESV and in most other translations. Thank you. Thank you. That's the one I overlooked. I mean, it's the one where he's literally dealing with this issue. And he literally says, a man is not justified by faith alone, faith only. So he literally says it. And so we talked about that. How do we get into a situation where we are now trying to explain theologies that literally contradict the Bible on the exact issue that it's talking about? So it's one thing if I proof text it. I say, okay, well, I want to say that James is really talking about final judgment. And I'm taking this passage about faith alone in a discourse about final judgment. No, he's literally talking about the relationship between faith and works. And he's specifically telling you, you are not justified by faith alone. So how do we get to a point where we want or crave the peace that surpasses understanding so much that we are now literally preaching the opposite thing that the text says in order to get that peace? And here's that thing. This is where that whole concept of truth and love comes into play, right? Because if the basis of my sense of peace is contradicting the literal teaching of the Bible on the specific topic I'm seeking peace on, right? How big a crash am I setting myself up for if I've lived a life and I've staked out a peace that's based on literally contradicting the plain language of the word? It's a huge crash, right? Why? Because I've heard over and over, just when I take a step back from discussing the specifics of the doctrinal difference, it's not like I hear people who believe that salvation is by faith only and it's something that you can't lose. It's not like they're not wrestling with it. I hear people in those churches continuing to emotionally wrestle with this topic of not feeling saved. And so it's not like they found the solution to the issue. And we talked about it before, right? It's like any other works-based solution. It's a temporary high. And so that's the irony of what's going on. You're literally having people who are interpreting what Paul says as a prohibition on works-based salvation, who, if you really think about it, we go back to idolatry. And we talked about it on Wednesday. In Isaiah 44, what were the tools of making an idol? Back in Isaiah 44, we said there were two kinds of idol makers he uses to illustrate the peril of idolatry. He said there's the smith, the one who works with metals, and there's the carpenter, the one who works with wood. If we focus on the one who works with wood in Isaiah 44, what kinds of things is he doing to fashion his idol? What tools is he using? What's that? Is that something to like smooth it out, right? That's right.
Chisel.
That's it, chisel, right? To get the details. What's that?
Hammers.
Right? And then the fundamental building material is a block of wood. And we said might not necessarily build a figurine now, but up until the age of laptops, the way that most of these doctrines came about was by men sitting down. What's a sheet of paper? What is a sheet of paper? It's basically a wood shaved real smooth into something I can write my theology on. And so that is what we're seeing here, is because you have to be careful that in preaching against works-based salvation, that your own theology is not a working either of your own mind or the mind of someone who was left out of the biblical canon. Because God made a choice, right? If he wanted to put Marcus in the biblical times and have me offer up my thoughts on salvation, he could have done that. But he left me out of the canon, right? And that is why it's wise to say, be a Berean, right? Because even Paul, who was in the canon, said test it. And so we have to ask ourselves, and I've said it before, we have to really challenge ourselves to question whether or not we are going to base our beliefs on the actions of people who were raising the dead, making the lame to walk, and making the blind see, or my favorite teacher who God chose to leave out of that period of revelation, right? And so that is what we're talking about. What is the stamp of divinity on the teaching that we have? And if we have gotten ourselves once again into a place where we are literally dismissing the words of people who were raising the dead in favor of people that God chose to leave out of the scriptural canon, you have to ask yourself, are you setting yourself up for disappointment? Especially if you look all around you and the people who believe in that belief system that was written honestly by a man who was left out of the canon is still leading to disappointment and still leading them to worry about, am I really saved? Am I really? And so that's it. So let me get off of that and get back to the, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Both sides of those are not good. If
Jordan.
you're on the faith only, you still wonder, well, is this all I can? But if you're on the work side, am I doing enough? Am I working enough? Am I doing the right? So either one of those extremes, you're always going to be, you got to get a good happy medium or whatever, a good understanding that, yes, I do works, but they're not going to save me in the end. And I'm, yes, I got to do something. I can't just go through life doing nothing for God.
And this is the important thing to distinguish, and this is why I need to go ahead and get into the actual text, because Philippians is not the only place where he says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. That other example where the concept of faith only literally comes up in the Bible, the other instance is where? We talked about it on Wednesday. Come on, help me out. Oh, my fault. Yeah, you were, weren't you? You weren't. My fault. Either way. So now I'm putting all the pressure. My fault. It's actually in Galatians, and that's why I asked you to turn to Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5. Who wants to begin at, and I don't want to get distracted, but I'm already off on tangents. So 5:4 through 6. 5:4 through 6.
You have been severed from Christ. You who are seeking to be justified by law. You have fallen from grace. For we, through the Spirit by faith, are waiting for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything, but faith working through love.
But faith what?
Working through love.
No, faith alone, brother. Your Bible's broken. I'm sorry. I'm saying I don't want to be facetious, but it literally says in Galatians, faith working. Okay? And so it's not, once again, this is not a Paul versus James issue. If you're trying to say that salvation is by faith alone, it's a Paul versus Paul issue. And so what happens is, I always try to say, we all do it, but it's an issue of proof texting. It's not taking Paul to his conclusion. It's taking a piece of his conclusion and making my own belief. We do the same thing here, done shamelessly with Ephesians. We're not in Ephesians yet, but in Ephesians 2, salvation is by grace alone. Salvation is by grace through faith through grace. Well, let's just read it. Ephesians 2. Verses 8 and 9. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one can boast. And so he gives you the purpose statement there. So how many times have you seen people who believe that salvation is by faith alone just stop there and not read the very next verse? Verse 10, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. And that goes back to that Abraham example. Once again, you're not teaching Paul against James, you're teaching Paul against Paul. You have to ask yourself, if it is not a doctrine of your own creation, why are you stopping short of verse 10? And ultimately, when we're looking at that whole concept of, okay, which works are being prohibited and which works are required, it's once again that illustration of Abraham trying to work out his salvation through Hagar, or trying to work out God's plan through Hagar, as opposed to the promise with Sarah. Look at it like this. If Abraham wants to take Sarah on a vacation, right? That's going to be great. That is going to help benefit the relationship, right? It's going to be okay, but if before Sarah was okay with the Hagar thing, if he's taking Hagar on vacations and leaving Sarah, okay, how's that going to work out? Thank you, right? So that is what we're talking about. And that is the difference between the works that are of the law of.
And if you're saved by faith only,
yep,
what they're saying is Abraham didn't have to do what he did.
Yeah, go ahead.
Abraham would have been okay if he'd stayed in Ur of the Chaldees.
And just done whatever he's
That's exactly what they're saying.
That's it.
He did not have to leave that and go if it's faith alone.
All right. And so what we're starting to see is the difference between the law and the law of Christ and the freedom. This is where the freedom and the enslavement begin to become, I think, a little bit more clear. Why? Because if we are walking in the love of Christ, then all those things that we would do for Sarah, God didn't have to tell you, like we talked about it before. Once COVID was over and the movie theaters began to reopen, he didn't have to tell us to go to the movies, right? You just know they're open and there's an opportunity there, right? You have freedom, once that movie theater is open, to go take Sarah out, celebrate the end of COVID, right? Understand all the freedom you have. The God didn't specifically have to tell you what to do. Oh, but if it's Hagar, that's when law steps in. And you are bound by having to be told what to do if you are not acting within the law of Christ. That's why there is another law in which there is freedom. In the marriage bond, there is freedom, right? If you put that together, not only the God-sanctioned marriage bond together with how you're supposed to love one another in church and in marriage relationship, oh, there's all kinds of freedom. Be creative, bud, right? Just as it says, love does no wrong or it does not seek its own, right? And so once you get into the deeper understandings of what the law of Christ is, now you're walking in the freedom to do all kinds of things that you can't do over here, right? And so that is the question of maturity. What is my priority? And let's look at some of these literal examples that Paul uses. in terms of what the actual point is under the law of Christ. So starting in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, we're going to see, once again, it's not a question of all law. It is a question of which law are you submitting to. Chapter 6, verse 1. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, right? And so what's the law of Christ based on? Well, let's back up to chapter 5, at verse 13, when he's literally linking this concept of freedom and love. Verse 13, for you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through, I'm asking for a fill in the blank. Should I keep it moving? Through love, serve one another, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so he's talking about the summation of the old law, really in a lot of ways being a linkage to the law under which we live. Why? Because Christ literally said, a new commandment I give you. Not that you love one another as you love yourselves. That seemed to be a pretty high standard. Wow, I got to be fair all the time? Okay. But now it's a sacrificial love. Now it's not just parity and fairness. It's loving sacrificially the way that Christ loved us. And so he's summing up the old law and passing the baton on to the law of Christ by saying your freedom to do is guided by your understanding of, talked about it before, the fundamentals. So the more you are deeply rooted in the actual spirit of the law, the less you are under a schoolmaster in which your comfort comes in. Okay, did I do exactly what God said? And what that is, it says, the one who fears, and this is a scripture that could describe my entire life as a Christian and not. The one who fears is not perfected in love. And so when I'm starting to fear whether or not I'm getting the law right or I'm getting my obedience right, and I'm starting to live in that fear as a pattern, it is helping me understand that there's a red flag in my relationship with God where I'm not properly motivated by the right things. And so it's not so bad when I'm starting to feel like this is too much. If I'm interpreting that feeling the right way, and I'm understanding that I don't need to carve out a theology that gives me a temporary relief from what feels like the burden of rules I just can't keep. It's me helping, it's those negative feelings are helping to guide me back to a place where my love is broken, or it hasn't become the priority, because I'm no longer trusting God the way that I need to, and therefore I'm not experiencing the freedom that I feel in my decision making, right? I'm feeling more of the guilt and the doubt and the fear, as opposed to not really, I won't say haphazardly having not a care in the world, but having, like it says, the peace that surpasses all understanding in whatever circumstance. That comes from being rooted in the right place, and the decisions simply flow from that place. All right, another couple of things we need to hurry up and talk about are this whole concept of down in chapter 6, verses, say, 6 through, let's just read 6 through 10, and that'll give me some time. Another famous passage from Paul. What does that talk about? And I'll need a reader this time because I'm distracted with writing.
Doing good to all people.
Go ahead. No, just go ahead and read it for me. Read it for me, please.
So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of faith.
No, 6 through 10. 6 through 10. 6 through 10. I'm sorry.
Wow.
6 through 10. Galatians 6, 6 through 10.
The one who is taught the word is to share all good things with the one who teaches him. Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life.
All right, so he's talking about a famous concept. You reap what you sow, right?
Yep.
All right. And so here's the problem with, like I said, I always talk about, I don't want to make it a doctrinal issue, but then I end up going off on these tangents, and here we go. All right. Paul literally says there that there's a sequence. We understand in life. Whatever you sow, you're going to reap. But here's the problem with the concept that salvation is by faith alone. What is the relationship under that belief system of works to your salvation? What's the belief system? Why do they say that they work? Because they see these passages about works, and they say, okay, this is why we work. We work because they say you work to be saved. We work because we are saved. But that literally flips what Paul is talking about. Why? Because Paul is talking about there is a sequence. And if we go back through 2 Corinthians and all of his other letters, he talks about there is a day of judgment where we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ to receive the results of
Our just recompense.
Yeah, for what we have done, right? And he's literally saying that even in Romans, when he's setting up that contrast between the world that we can sometimes condemn and the things that we do that are actually just like those things in the world. He's saying, look, if you're doing the same things that you condemn in the world, God is going to appear to condemn you for doing the same works, literally. And so ultimately, I haven't articulated as much as I would like here, but bottom line is we have to be careful of those direct contradictions that give us a temporary comfort, but are completely inconsistent with what God describes. Why? Because here, what he actually is giving us in the way of comfort from Galatians, if we really, really understand what he's talking about, and I may take some time because I'm running out of time now, there's another dimension of it that goes into the way in which works are both an enhancement of your relationship with God, but they're also a disqualifying, they have the ability to disqualify you. And why is it that your works have the ability, literally in Paul's teaching, to disqualify you from salvation? It is, exactly. Go ahead. And he talks about that in Galatians, right?
Yep.
All right. And we said there is a term or phrase that he uses over and over again to illustrate the ultimate effects. You say, okay, well, these are the works of the flesh, but what's it really worth? Okay, fine, I get a smaller house in heaven. I'm okay with that as long as I make it, right? But he says over and over, do not be deceived. I before ye, except after see. Yes. And so that passage in 2 Corinthians where he's talking about, okay, if anybody builds on the foundation of Christ with not gold and silver, but kind of worthless things, their work is going to be burned up, but they are going to still be saved through fire. Is he saying that if I go build on any foundation whatsoever that I'm going to be saved? He's literally talking about building on the foundation of Christ. And so it goes back to this thing that we talked about with Abraham and Sarah. When Abraham left the promise to work on his own terms, what consequences did it bring him? Misery, strife. But we don't necessarily know what the ultimate end of that would have been because Abraham went back to the path. He then went back to obeying God. Why? Because he had to, as hard as it was for him, he had to send Hagar away, right? He had to send one of his sons who he loved away, right? And so we know what happened because he corrected his course. And we have to ask yourself, when Paul consciously chose to pick an example, why did he pick an example of a man who corrected his course instead of one who simply strayed off and did whatever he wanted and simply trusted the grace of God to save him wherever he was? Paul picked Abraham for a reason, because he understands that we are people who are imperfect, and whether voluntarily or involuntarily, we're straight from the path. But he used Abraham as an example of a person who got back onto the path, walking in the footsteps of faith so that he could restore his relationship with God. And that's what we have here. It is not faith versus works. It's faith working. Why? Because Marcus said no, because that's literally what Paul said. The footsteps of faith are literally what Paul used to describe the relationship of godly people to their God, right? And work out your own salvation with fear and trembling had everything to do with the actions that we do in obeying the commands of God, as opposed to editing the commands of God. It's one of the things we talked about a little bit on Wednesday. We'll finish with that. What's the difference between an editor and a student?
Editor fixes the problems that the student made.
in certain circumstances, right? But if we're just looking at a textbook, I'm going into a new class, I got a new textbook for science, something I know nothing
The
about.
editor guides the reporter, the writer of it, to where they want to be in the end, and
Yeah.
it's the student or whoever's job to get from A to B.
Right, just by using the textbook. Nobody hired you to be an editor, buddy, right? You're a student, you're here to learn. And so as Christ people, we're his, literally, he says, go into all the world, make literally disciples, right? So he said, I don't need help writing this law, buddy, right? I need you to obey it. And so in a lot of ways, that's what this gets to. It's a question of good.
And he uses Abraham.
Yeah.
Because you go through the Old Testament and there's all kinds of God's people, men, David and just name them off, who do the same kinds of things.
Yep, but
he uses Abraham because to the Israelites, Abraham's the goat.
okay. And I'm not even getting into the greatest day in football history just happening this weekend. We're not going to talk. Okay, I'm
Well,
sorry.
and if you look at the path to heaven, it's a straight line
There
that
you go.
God has set aside for us.
Yeah.
It's Abraham that decided to make the curve.
Yeah.
And it's David that made a lot of curves.
Right.
And so it's not a hard concept. It's not a hard path. It's not hard what's laid in front of us.
Hard
We
to live.
make it difficult because we go, oh, that looks pretty.
Thank you, man. Right? Yes, right.
My brother-in-law, Richard, we go backpacking. He's a doctor, is what he says.
All right.
Because his head is doing this.
Squirrel.
And he's walked off the trail many a times.
Yeah.
Because if you're not looking where you're going, you're not going to see where you're going.
I mean, I'm not going to keep going because we got to finish, but yes, that's
I
a
know.
good illustration to end on. So, yes. And I know this wasn't as clear as I wanted it to be, so I hope to indulge the patience of anybody looking afterward, much less the patience of people actually suffering in person. So I thank you. And hopefully me setting up the camera cuts Brian a little bit of slack on my normal time issues. So with that, we're done.